Compiled by Decoded Communications, the South African government leaders on X report assesses how government leaders use the X social media platform to engage with South Africans they represent. The report highlights the important role of social media in creating spaces where leaders and citizens can meet, exchange ideas, and grapple with the pressing issues that shape our everyday lives. For more on this, we're now joined by Decoded Communications CEO Lorato Tshenkeng, and he joins us now via our video link. Lorato, thank you so much for your time this evening here in SABC News. Now, you've compiled the South African government leaders on X report. Maybe just take us through it when it comes to some of the key findings that you have obtained.
Good evening, Bali, and good evening to your viewers. So, one of the interesting findings in the report, of course, is that out of the 34 cabinet ministers, only 30 of them are on X. And, some of the other findings are that while, or at least of the 30, there are 4 accounts of, for instance, Minister Barbara Creasy, the Minister of Women, Young People and Persons with Disability, Sindisiwe Chikunga. Their accounts are inactive, right? So, and the idea was to also not only just to look at the numbers, but was to do a little bit of a deep dive in terms of the kind of content that the ministers' accounts and the deputy ministers' accounts, would put out. As an example, you can imagine, or at least one of the other findings is that controversy and crisis seemingly, generated the biggest conversation points. Example, the Stilfontein matter with the Operation Valamgoti, with Minister Senzo Mchunu. He experienced the highest growth out of all of the cabinet members, and precisely because of the Dr. McPherson, who's at the Home Affairs. You'd remember last year, the Chidima Adechina issue with Home Affairs and her status, and they generated a lot of conversation, and no surprises as well with Minister Gayton McKenzie, who is either giving away tickets or having run-ins with his deputy minister Pismab. You remember just while he was there in France during the Olympics. So those are just some of the few highlights.
And some of the highlights that you firstly touched on was the fact that from 34 ministers, 30 are at least, on the social media platform X. And, you've also given us a number of examples when it comes to ministers engaging with the public, engaging with essentially their voters as well. And when you look at some of these examples, would you say that, political leaders or office bearers of government are using this X platform effectively?
So it's a mixed bag, Mbali. Mixed bag because you have somebody like Minister Solimalatsi, right, of digital technologies and communications. When he came in, a lot of his updates were really around the stakeholder engagements that he was involved in, right? Of course, we know SABC as one of the agencies that is under him. There were a number of issues, including now with the bill that is now sent back to Parliament, right? And it created a lot of talkability. But one of the interesting things about him, as an example, is that he would, whenever people would either ask questions or make ill-informed statements or wrong statements, he would then correct them. And you have other ministers, who are on social media, but they don't even put out, or all that they do is to either retweet their departments, and broadcast messages. Department of Labor and Employment minister is one of those. There's no response to when people asking questions. And unfortunately, one of the things that is going to happen when you're a politician and when you're a minister, if you talk about one thing, think about the Minister of Labor and Employment, right? They would be talking about some of these raids that they are doing or inspections, and somebody would then be asking about UIF. Right, the one way that, and that's why I was saying it's a mixed bag. So if you think about Gauteng Premier Lesufi, one of the things that he has done exceptionally well is that when he does not have an answer to a question or a query that is raised by a citizen, he would tag the relevant department. And therefore, that is the biggest thing that is missing in how they are, missing the opportunity to engage with citizens on these platforms.
And talking about engagement, right, we also know that there are some ministers, who control their own accounts. And there are some departments or ministers, their accounts are controlled, by the communications department within their office. And were you able to spot really in terms of these engagements, if this is actually the minister speaking or this is information being given by the minister's department?
Yes, so and very few of them are actually handled by the departments, right? So, for instance, the president and the deputy president, you can tell by the tone of voice, the tone of the accounts, that they are handled by professional teams who are always putting out professional messages, right? And then you have somebody like the Deputy Minister of Defense, who's the second most followed person on X, right? He's always putting out tweets based on the way, we know he's a person of banter. He generally, he takes the jabs and he gives them back. You can tell that it's him. So majority of the accounts seemingly are handled by, the politicians themselves. And unlike in the US, Mbali, if I were to make this point, which is, again, it's one of the biggest missed opportunities. In the US, when former President Biden was leaving office on the 19th of January this year, on the 20th, his account would have been the presidential account would have been archived, right? And then when President Donald Trump takes over, there's a new account that is set up, and it is not only for for citizens to engage, but it is also for academics, researchers, historians, for them to be able to go into their account, because once you create an archive, it means that researchers are able to go into these accounts, see do whatever it is that is needed to be done. In sometime in the future, people want to write books on the conduct and behavior of politicians. How do you do that when somebody like a former Minister Fikile Mbalula of Transport, he was one of the most followed Twitter followers while he was a minister. He has now moved away with all of that social capital. Yeah. So the question is, why are we not, finding a way of doing this? And you realize that you'd remember, and again, just this last point, you'd remember when there was that tete-a-tete between Minister Gayton McKenzie and Peace Mabe, his deputy minister. The minister of in the presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, quickly had to come up and say, listen, we are going to have to workshop all ministers on how they conduct themselves and behave on the social media platforms.
And, looking at some of the issues that have been addressed because of the matters being highlighted on social media. I mean, you speak about the issue last year with Home Affairs and with Chidima in the country when it comes to her status. And looking at some of the issues which have been raised in the communication there from the government. And would you say that this has also changed how government communicates directly with South Africans?
In some departments it has, right? So you have, for instance, the Home Affairs matter as it was coming up last year, right? It created an opportunity for citizens to be able to ask questions to the department around whether it was issues of corruption, whether it's identity fraud, identity theft, and the likes, right? Then there was, of course, the other issues just around the services that people, ordinarily wanted. And of course, last year, it being an election year, you'd remember that we saw Home Affairs extending its office hours so that people can come and get their ID so that they are able to vote. So, there was then a spotlight on Home Affairs,
Yeah.
which created a huge opportunity for them to be able to continuously communicate, the work they do,
All right.
communicate their successes and the likes.
All right,
But
quickly.
we're not seeing that.
Quickly, if you can also wrap up for us, because we are running out of time. What can they do better?
One, they need to ensure that all accounts have grey check marks. The grey check marks are only, reserved for politicians and government institutions and bilateral or multilateral organizations. Two, they need to, consider having teams manage their social accounts instead of doing it themselves. Lastly, they need to be responsive to South Africans.
All right. And that last point that you make, very important for our country, particularly with a platform of that nature, to respond, of course, to South Africans. That is Decoded Communications CEO Lorato Tshenkeng. They're talking to us about his report, the report of South African government leaders on X.